Welcome to week 12. We will be covering chapter 11, which is theories of personality. Here is the to-do list for the week. The objectives seem very simple. There's not as many items here, but each objective is sort of complex. So if we start to break these down, you're going to see that each one involves multiple components. So just be careful there. Make sure that you're getting everything. So we're going to be looking at the construct of personality and then how we view it in psychology. So there are many different perspectives about how a person's personality develops, where it comes from, things that contribute to personality. And so I really want to just highlight before we dig in, that not one theory is more accurate than another. They're just different lenses with which we can look at personality. So just understand that they're just different from one another, but each has its own tenets that add value to the complete understanding of a person. So we'll start with like the historical perspective behind personality. Actually, the field of personality really got started from the work of Freud. He was a clinician, and he worked with clients who had psychoses, problems, I guess you could say, that couldn't be resolved. And so he would sit down and talk with them. And this is where our typical sit on the couch and talk to the psychologist sort of image comes from. He was the first to sort of do that. And he would have patients talk about their lives and talk about their internal struggles. And he put together a rather complex theory as to how he felt a person develops, i.e. how their personality develops. And his theory is known as the psychodynamic theory. And it's very multifaceted. He talked about the different elements of psychodynamic theory. He was big on the unconscious mind, so that's a big component of Freud's theory, is that we have this huge reservoir, which is our unconscious mind, and that it's largely untapped, and that we're not always aware, i.e. it's unconscious, of how it's operating or how it's affecting us in our daily lives. So, in other words, we often do things and say things that we don't really know where that comes from. We might not be able to pinpoint how we came to a certain conclusion or an understanding, but we do it. We have kind of ways of reacting when we're under stress and pressure, when we are dealing with something difficult. So part of Freud's theory involves defense mechanisms, and how we sort of use these mechanisms as a means to maintain our identity and maintain our self-worth and value. If we are under stress in a situation, we can sort of protect ourselves. It's a self-buffer against any negative effects of something we might have caused inadvertently. And so this is why it's termed defense mechanism. So you're going to dive in to a lot of what Freud had to say, and this really formed the basis for current psychoanalytic theory. So psychoanalytic is just a more popular term, a more current term for psychodynamic theory. And people still practice it today, although Freud had some very challenging things to say about personality. He placed a lot of emphasis on sexual drives. And so, he got very popular from this because this was developing during a time when no one was talking about that kind of thing. But he didn't really have a lot of grounding for a lot of his theories. They were based off of observation only, and sort of his theories, a lot of what he had to say were never exactly tested. So modern psychoanalytic theory, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And those that subscribe to modern psychoanalytic theory would be Jung, Adler, Horney, and Erikson. They sort of took Freud's theories and modified them each just a bit. So you'll read about what additions they made to that theory of personality. Then we'll start to get into more of how is it practiced today. So how would we see modern psychoanalytic theory operating now in a clinical setting, as patients come in and they're working with a therapist on issues that they're having in their life? So we'll move from that whole area of psychoanalytic and psychodynamic into another perspective on personality, which is behaviorism and social cognition. So the behaviorist and social cognitive theories are very different from Freud. They were actually sort of a backlash to Freud. They felt Freud was very pessimistic and mechanistic in how he explained personality, that he didn't leave a lot of room for human growth and potential. If we look at Freud's theories, a lot of what he said had to do with, a person being at the whim of their unconscious desires, and that we don't really have a lot of control over that. And so people like Skinner and Watson, who were behaviorists, came along and said, well, people do have some control, and we are products of our environment. We learn from experience, we learn from our social surroundings, and we form our ideas and our identity and our personality based on that. So we'll take a look at theirs. And then lastly, the kind of big theory, overarching theory to personality would be the humanistic theory. And Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow are two names to know there. They're proponents of the humanistic approach to personality, which basically sees people as good and striving to achieve an ideal sense of oneself. That when we have mental disorders that come about, like anxiety and depression, that these sort of psychoses arise out of us being sort of out of tune with who we are and who we want to be. So Rogers' humanistic approach sort of looks at a person's personality as always striving to achieve their ideal self of who they can be. And it's a very positive sort of approach to personality. It looks at the person with an unconditional positive regard, which is kind of like what a parent should or does have with their child, in that a child could do something really wrong and a parent's still going to love them. And so Rogers employed this type of strategy with all of his clients, making people feel very comfortable coming to him with, a mess of problems in life circumstances, feeling oftentimes guilty or regretful over decisions or things that have happened. And Rogers would, embrace that, display a good level of empathy, and try to understand a person's perspective. And so that was sort of how he viewed personality. And you'll see some current takes. This is still very big in practice today in clinical psychology. So those are sort of like grounding theories. And then we have what's called the trait perspective. And I think this is probably the most popular approach to personality today. It isn't sort of like a historical perspective per se, but it's really this idea that we are who we are as sort of a collective set of traits that we carry about ourselves. And that this can come from biological influences, what is passed down to us genetically, as well as who we develop as people through our experiences. Trait perspective looks at the different aspects of a person. So we'll talk about the big 5 personality trait inventory, and sort of how that came about. And that's kind of like a big overarching way of looking at personality today. We'll take a look at the Myers-Briggs personality assessment, which you are all actually going to be taking a version of online and figuring out some things about yourself. And trait perspective is wildly popular because it's used in a lot of applied settings. So a lot of employers might have their employees take these types of tests so that they can learn more about them. One of the positive things about it is that you learn kind of what your strengths and weaknesses are as a person. Like, how do you handle adversity? or changes or new settings. What are you like in social situations? Are you dependable and reliable, or are you kind of like a free spirit? So you learn some things about who you are, and they're very reliable and valid. So in all of these perspectives and explanations, they'll actually talk about reliability and validity, and how can we trust in the sources of where we're getting this information about ourselves. And so it will dive into some advantages and disadvantages of using different measures of personality. So the text spends some time talking about how do we measure a person's personality. And there's many methods of doing that, like interviews, projective tests, which tap into the unconscious. So that would be under psychodynamic theory. Different behavioral assessments, just watching what people do in their behavior, and that would definitely fall under the behaviorist and social cognitive perspective. But then also personality inventories, basically many item tests which are designed to elicit an understanding of some key aspects of personality. So I think you guys are going to enjoy this chapter. There's a lot here. Here are your lecture slides, and all the videos you're going to be watching this week are in episode 13 of personality. And then here is your discussion for the week. Now, the discussion veers off just a tad in talking about type A personality. It is also in your book. So again, not only does the Hawk reading talk about type A, but so does your Cicerelli and White textbook. So you should be integrating both as you're answering these questions, using both those sources to support your answers. And then here is where I have you take the Myers-Briggs type personality. It's an online assessment. You can just click right here and take it. And when you finish the test, it's going to spit out a ton of results. What I want you to look at is, what is your overall personality type? It's going to give you a name, and it's going to give you a little acronym. Everyone's going to get a 4-letter acronym that is going to form the basis for your personality type. Each letter in the acronym stands for a different tenet or a different aspect of your personality. So you want to write that down. And then it's going to tell you what your personal strengths and weaknesses are. You, for that personality type that you got, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? And so you're going to blend that into your discussion for this week. I think it'll be super interesting because it's something that's going to be unique for everyone. So you've got some basics here in terms of the article and how I want you answering those questions. But then you've got kind of like this fun part to it that's really unique to you. And I think it'll be interesting to see what everybody says and what they get, and then compare what personality types we have in our class. So hopefully you have a little fun with that. We do have a quiz this week on the chapter 11, and then you have an exam which covers chapter 10, social psych, and chapter 11, personality. So that is the week in view. Please let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great week, everybody.